Alrighty, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whenever you happen to be listening to this. We are looking at Chapter 21 today in Emerging World Power. Going from 1890 to 1918. So we're going to span two wars, Spanish-American War and World War I. Talk about exciting. Alright. So speaking of World War I, these are American soldiers in a trench on the Western Front in Europe during World War I. A lot of the fighting was done with trench warfare, which actually caused a stalemate. The Americans are one of the ones who kind of helped them out of that stalemate. You can see them there occupying a devastated landscape. They face explosions and gunfire, and they confront death all around them. The photograph conveys the difficulty of soldiers' lives and the ways the experience must have shaped them over the long term. So, imagine having to deal with that on a daily basis and then come home and live your regular life. Alrighty, so on the left here we have a man named Josiah Strong. He's a Congregationalist minister, encouraged Protestants to spread Christianity overseas. An example of American exceptionalism. He wrote a book called Our Country in 1885. The United States had a unique destiny to foster democracy and civilization throughout the world. I think we still feel like that. Viewpoint linked to the racial theories that supported white supremacy and social Darwinism. Survival of the fittest, white people are better, yada yada yada, etc., etc. The gentleman over here on the right, his name is Alfred G. Mahan. The influence of sea power upon history. He's a U.S. naval officer. He argued that naval power was essential to empire building. In 1890, Congress approved funding for 3 battleships. Secretary of State Richard Olney warned that the United States would use these new naval tools in the Western Hemisphere to protect its interests. So, Alfred Mahan. Now, he is a star-tested, just FYI, and he's been on the test a couple of times. And when you see Alfred T. Mahan, just remember Navy guy and ships and stuff, and that should be helpful. Alright, so we move on to the War of 1898. So when we say from expansion to imperialism, so basically, we've been practicing basically expansion. So we are expanding what is already there. We're not going beyond. We're not going out to the oceans or anything like that. It's land that we are basically attached to, so the continental U.S. So let's talk Cuban Rebellion. So February 1895, Cubans began a guerrilla war against Spain. The Spanish began policy of concentration camps. 200,000 Cubans died from starvation and disease. The Spanish really had no qualms about fighting dirty, basically, and cruelly, violently. And when these uprisings would start, they would just kind of take all the Cubans and arrest them and put them in concentration camps. William Randolph Hearst publicized the plight of the Cubans in newspaper stories. President Cleveland wanted the Spanish to end the crisis. His successor, McKinley, was ready to take a stand on issue. New Spanish government offered limited self-rule, and their effort failed. So basically, we tried to buy Cuba numerous times. Spanish didn't want to sell it. The Cubans don't want to be under Spanish control. They're fighting for their independence on numerous occasions, but aren't actually successful. So it's not till 1898 when we actually help them out and they are more successful. So part of this, there's a lot of things that lead up to this. With the Cuban Rebellion, like I said, Hearst and Pulitzer, they're competing for readers, so they're putting all kinds of sensational things in the newspaper. And one of them is what's going on in Cuba. So they put that in there. They tell all the readers about the cruelty. People are all up in arms about it. A little later on, there's a letter from the Spanish minister, Dupuy de Lume. He is critical of McKinley's policies. And so he writes this letter, and it is published in the newspaper. So now you've told people how terrible things are in Cuba. Now you've told people how unfit the president is. And then the Maine happens. So what happens? The Maine, which is a ship, explodes and sinks in Havana Harbor. It kills 260 Americans. So that gets advertised as well, and basically they're accusing the Spanish of blowing it up. There's no evidence to that fact, and actually many years later they find out that it kind of it exploded. It didn't get blown up, and it was like technical problems or something. So, "Remember the Maine" becomes a national chant. So war fever is growing. So you have all these things kind of combining together. So McKinley really has no choice but to ask Congress to declare war. April 1898 is when war begins. You have the Teller Amendment, which assured Americans that McKinley's administration would not try to occupy Cuba. More than 200,000 men volunteered, including our friend Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. In May of 1898, American ships destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay, and that's the Philippines. It turns naval attention to Hawaii, where the United States had a base at Pearl Harbor. Hawaii was annexed in July of 1898. We moved to gain Guam and Puerto Rico. Roosevelt led the Rough Riders in the Battle of San Juan Hill. Eventually, the Spanish do surrender. It only takes about 4 months. It's a very short war. And they surrendered in July of 1898. There are actually more casualties from disease, malaria, and yellow fever than there is battle wounds. It's not a grisly war or anything like that. I think really we take the Spanish by surprise. We come in with our navy and whatnot. And it's way more than the Cubans could have done on their own. So we assist them with that, and as a result of these wars with Spain, we get most of the territories that they have out in the Pacific. So this is going to include Puerto Rico, it's going to include Guam, the Philippines. We get Hawaii, but Hawaii was not a Spanish territory. It was a monarchy, and we had Americans that were living there. They basically take over, because you can't imagine that, right? Going into somebody's native land and taking it over. It's crazy talk, right? Anyway, they take it over, and previous presidents to McKinley didn't really want to be involved in it. They didn't want to reward people for stealing land. Essentially, McKinley has no qualms. So in 1898, they annex Hawaii. So a lot of times when they talk about the Spanish-American War and they talk about the territories that the United States gains as a result of the Spanish-American War, you will see Hawaii in the list. Not technically true, but it happens at the same time, so it is often kind of lumped together. And this is where we're starting with imperialism, and this is our first time we have colonies. So Guam and Puerto Rico are territories, as is Hawaii, and the Philippines. Cuba, on the other hand, is considered a protectorate, and we basically help them out, I guess is what you could say. All right. So Spain agrees to liberate Cuba. They ceded Puerto Rico and Guam. McKinley wants to annex the Philippines because of the harbor at Manila. We want another military base. So the debate ensues in the United States, with many taking an anti-imperialist stand, so being against it. People like Jane Addams and Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, Samuel Gompers, they're all against taking in territories. Growth of anti-imperialist leagues, but there's no mass movement. The Philippines, Spain ceded the country to the United States in the Treaty of Paris for $20 million. February 1899, fighting began between Americans and Filipinos around Manila. The war lasted 3 years. Basically, it's an insurrection, and we try to tamp down the insurrection. It takes 3 years. It's very brutal. You lose 4,200 Americans, but you lose about 200,000 Filipinos. McKinley gets reelected in 1900, and questions start to arise about citizenship for people who are newly annexed. And just on a side note, I think the people in Puerto Rico don't become citizens until maybe the 1940s. I might have that date wrong, but it's not when they're annexed for sure. So that's our branching into imperialism, and if you ever wondered why we have Guam, which is almost all the way to China, this would be why. Alright, So this is also when we really start to get involved in other people's business. So China and Japan, they have a little war, the first Sino-Japanese War, and it kind of shows how weak China is. China had always really stayed to itself. They didn't get involved in anything. They didn't want anybody involved with them. But when this happens, it kind of opens the door for other countries to be like, we want to trade with you. And trying to break up China into different territories, essentially in colonies. However, the United States comes in and they demand an open door policy in China in 1899. Because we want to have economic relationships with China. And so we feel like this is the best way, is to basically open the whole country for trade with all other countries. And so that's the Open Door Act policy, whatever you want to call it, but open door. However, there are many people in China that are not happy with this. They're called the Boxers. They're a secret society of Chinese nationalists, and they rebel against the European and Japanese rule in China in 1900. The United States sends 5,000 troops to aid the Europeans and take down the insurrection. It is very bloody and very, very bad. Let's see. As far as Japan goes, they gained strength in Asia in the late 19th century. They defeated Russia in 1905. So this is another interesting thing. So Japan and Russia have a war. All right. So us over in America, you know, all of a sudden we need to go and talk to Russia and Japan and help them hammer out an agreement. So you have the, let's see, they defeat Russia in 1905, and Roosevelt goes and kind of brokers a deal between the two. We also come up with what's a gentleman's agreement. So kind of in return, so like I said, Japan wins. Kind of in return, Japan wants, this is, so we love our segregation. We are segregating Japanese students in schools, kind of making them have their own school in San Francisco, I think it is. And so Japan does not like that. And so they basically tell Teddy Roosevelt, he's like, okay, so you need to stop segregating our students from the other students. And Teddy says, okay, well, we'll stop doing that, but you need to stop granting visas to Japanese citizens to come to the United States. So that's considered a gentleman's agreement, and that took place in 1907. All right, you have the Root Takahira Agreement in 1908, which recognizes Japanese authority over Manchuria and open commerce. President Taft wants a greater role for Americans in Asia, and he supports the Chinese Revolution of 1911. All right. We have the Hay-Pauncefote, I don't know, treaty in 1901. So efforts to build a canal across Central America. Treaty recognized the sole right of the United States to build and fortify a canal. Problem is that we want to build this canal across Panama. All right. So Teddy Roosevelt has his big stick diplomacy. He believed that the United States must have a strong navy with rapid access to the Atlantic and Pacific. So to do this, we need a canal. So Congress allocates $10 million plus $250,000 a year to buy a strip of land across Panama from Colombia. Now, the problem is Panama is part of Colombia. And Colombia does not want us to purchase that land. And so what do? We help the Panamanians fight for independence, and we recognized it as a new nation in 1903. By 1904, we are building that canal. Go us. It takes about 8 years to build, and it opens in 1914. So basically, the Panama Canal, we leased the land that it's on, or the area that it was on. We built it, and we maintained and held it for close to 100 years. So it's only been recently that it was returned back to the Panamanians to control basically the agreement that it would be open and neutral. Oh, I'm sorry. Went too far. Remember way back when with the Monroe Doctrine? It wasn't really utilized. It basically said We're not open for colonization anymore. Europe, stay out. And for the most part, they do. It wasn't really anything. There wasn't really much left to colonize at that point. But Roosevelt thinks we need to have a little bit of additional peace on that. So he adds the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and it basically says the United States has unrestricted right to regulate Caribbean affairs. So essentially what he's saying is if there's any problems, you come to us and we will take care of it. We will help work with you. So this is where our history of being involved in everybody's business really starts, is in this late time period with the Spanish-American War. And this is when we start opening ourselves up to other countries. All right. Wilson is critical of his predecessor's foreign policies, but his was not very different. Relations with Diaz is positive for investors in late 19th century. Change of government supported by the United States in 1911. Francisco Madero was murdered in 1913. Wilson feared that U.S. interests would be negatively impacted by Mexican instability. You have U.S. occupation of Veracruz in April of 1914, and Huerta's government collapses. Carranza is victorious, and the relationships worsened when General Pancho Villa killed 16 Americans in New Mexico. And then you have clashes between the United States and Mexican troops. Keep that in mind for a little bit as we get to World War I. All right, so let's see. You have two parts of this war. You have the Triple Alliance, and this is going to be Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. Austria, Hungary being one country. And you have the Triple Entente, so that's Britain, France, and Russia. In June of 1914, you have the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne led these alliances into war. So basically, we have the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He is killed in Serbia. No, I mean, he's killed on a little tour by the Serbs. When that happens, Russia is tied to the Serbs. So Germany, who is an ally with Austria-Hungary, declares war. And so when it does that, then France and Great Britain have to jump in to help out Russia, and Austria-Hungary and Italy have to jump in to help out Germany. And Italy will change sides in the middle of the war, so just keep that in mind. Let's see. There's a lot of technology that's going to make this the deadliest war to date. Not to today's date, but it was definitely a really bad war. Long-range, high-velocity rifles. Millions of soldiers fought in trenches on the Western Front. Germans used poison gas. Hundreds of thousands died with no movement of the front line. So a stalemate. What happens with us here in the United States is we try to keep neutral. Wilson was not about really kind of getting involved in those foreign affairs. He tries to keep America out of the war because he wants to influence the post-war settlement. You have the British naval blockade, which makes neutrality nearly impossible. The Germans are using their U-boats, which is a submarine, in April of 1915, sinking ships. And they sink the Lusitania, which is a British ship, but there are Americans on the British ship. And so that angers the United States. So Wilson talks to the Germans, basically, and is like, you need to leave. Ships with Americans on it alone. We are not involved in this. Germany kind of half-assed agrees with the Sussex Agreement. They say, okay, we won't do this anymore. That lasted for about a year, but basically they lied. And when they got tired of sitting around, they started bombing. They practiced unrestricted submarine warfare. This is one of the reasons we enter the war. The other thing that happens is you have the Zimmerman telegram. And this is going to allege that Mexico might be persuaded to join a war against the United States to regain Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. So essentially, they're sent a telegram that basically says, so Germany sends Mexico a telegram. And it says, Dear Mexico, if you attack the United States, when we win this war, because we're Germany and we will, then we will help you get back your territories. Fortunately for us, we will never know if Mexico would have done that or not because we intercepted the telegram. So the Mexicans never received the telegram. Let's see, April of 1917. After all this is kind of put together, Wilson finally asks for a war declaration. All right. Let's see. So the war starts in 1914. We joined the war in late 1917. The U.S. Army had fewer than 200,000 soldiers because we were not preparing to go to war. So the draft began in May of 1917. General Pershing led the American Expeditionary Force of the AEF. Through May of 1918, most fighting was done by French and British. The revolution in Russia leads to a peace agreement between Germany and Russia. This is a Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which I'll never be able to say these words, but anyway, that gives Germany part of Central Europe, Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltics. So war begins in Russia. So in 1917, the Bolsheviks overthrow the Russian government and the Russian Tsar and do some terrible things and overtake the country, and it is a communist regime. So that will lead to a Red Scare in the 1920s, and then obviously the growth of the Soviet Union leads to the next one in the 1950s. But basically, Russia pulls out of the war, we join the war. They don't happen, it's not a result of, they're just coincidences that coincide. We come in 1917 after everybody's been fighting for 3 years at a stalemate with fresh troops, and we turn the tide of the war. So the American forces help the British and the French. They force a German retreat by September of 1918. And there's an armistice signed on November 11th, 1918. So 11/11. Approximately 4 million American men served in the United States military. 400,000 African Americans. Services were segregated with intense racial discrimination. Over 50,000 United States soldiers were killed in action. 63,000 died of disease, basically the flu, influenza. 8 million deaths combined from the Allied and Central Powers. It is a very, very deadly war, but we come out virtually unscathed in comparison. We lose a lot of people, but it's nothing like what was lost in France and Great Britain, Germany, Russia. But we are seen as the savior. So that is going to make it a lot harder for us not to be involved in World War II when it happens. Alright, so while the war is going on, we basically have to mobilize our economy. U.S. companies sold grain, weapons, and manufactured items to Europe. U.S. banks lent capital to other nations. You have the War Industries Board, which established in July of 1917 to direct military production. Fuel Administration introduced daylight saving time to save coal and oil. The Food Administration, in August of 1917, said food will win the war. 1918, the National War Labor Board established an 8-hour workday for workers with time and a half overtime pay, and endorsement of equal pay for women. Workers made a no-strike pledge in exchange for NWLB's support for their right to organize. Wilson believed it was necessary to suppress dissent. There's the Committee on Public Information, led by George Creel, propaganda agency to educate people about democracy. Assimilating Immigrants campaign for 100% Americans. You have the American Protective Leagues, which sent to spy on Americans searching for peace activists, draft evaders. You have the Espionage and Sedition Act from 1917 and 18, which led to the convictions of more than 1,000 people. A debate over the extensive powers of the federal government during wartime. U.S. Supreme Court mostly supported the legislation. What you see here on the right, these are some posters that were put up during World War I. Immigrants are often the audience for these wartime advertisements, which ask, "Remember your first thrill of American liberty." Loyalty is their duty during wartime to support the United States government efforts overseas by buying bonds. The Statue of Liberty is going to evoke a sense of nostalgia for that first feeling those who entered the United States through Ellis Island, New York, might have had when they saw the statue for the first time. So the thrill of American liberty. So you can see that poster right here. Red, white, and blue. Red and blue and white with a little bit of yellow, but definitely that's for contrast. The Hun is going to be the Germans, so you can see a little helmet. That's how they place the Germans. So if you see a little picture with a German on it. And they're often demonic presidents. You see he's got bloody hands and a bayonet. And so it's basically scare tactics. So you need to help us out so that these people don't come attack you. Because you would be sad if they did. So, alright. Other things that are going on at the time, over 400,000 African Americans moved from the South to the North for wartime work. Many, of course, found discrimination and racism in the North, but they have better working and living conditions than in the South. It's not great, but it's better. From 1917 to 1920, approximately 100,000 Mexicans entered the United States for work. The National Women's Party and the National American Women's Suffrage Association supported Wilson's war effort, hoping that patriotism by women would aid the cause of suffrage. Alice Paul led the NWP with a confrontational approach, including protests at the White House in July of 1917 that led to the women's arrests. In January of 1918, Wilson announced support of a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage as a war measure. House of Representatives passes the 19th Amendment in 1919, and the Senate passes it 18 months later. The United States ratifies the amendment in August of 1920. Other countries granted women's rights after World War I as well. Soviet Union, Great Britain, and Canada. Although it's communist in the Soviet Union, so I'm not sure what they were granting them, but that's a whole nother story for a whole nother day. But basically, there's a lot going on at home, even though we're fighting a war. So what happens after the war? Not necessarily so great for Germany or the Americans. So Wilson has a very idealized view of what should happen. And he goes to the meetings in Versailles with his 14-point policy. He's looking for open diplomacy, freedom of seas, removal of economic barriers, reduction of armaments, adjustment of colonial claims, talking about division and restoration and redrawing of a whole bunch of different countries. And then at the bottom, the 14th point, is creating an association of nations which becomes the League of Nations. At Versailles, who do we have there? We have France, Britain, and the United States. I believe Italy was there too. Rejected Japanese declaration of racial equality. They do have a desire to punish Germany for the war. It is very strong. So most of what happens in Versailles is this agreement that Germany is to blame. So Germany is forced to pay $33 billion in reparations and give up coal supplies, merchant ships, patents, and some territory to France, Alsace-Lorraine. There are 9 new independent states that come out of World War I. Central power colonies in Africa were dismantled and assigned as mandates instead of being granted freedom. The British mandate in Palestine, now Israel, led to thousands of Jews moving there for land. Riots between Palestinians and Jews occurred as early as 1920. Wilson suggested a League of Nations. So he has all these meetings. They don't really take a whole lot of what Wilson puts in his 14 points. But one of the things they do is the League of Nations. And so Wilson comes back to the United States, and he can't just sign off on the treaty. He has to have congressional approval. Problem is, Congress does not want to approve it. The Republican Party is openly hostile toward the treaty and toward the continued U.S. involvement in world affairs. Wilson travels extensively to convince people to support the treaty, and he suffers a stroke in September of 1990. 1990? He's dead by then. 1919. So the treaty fails. Congress does not approve it. When Congress does not approve this treaty, we do not join the League of Nations. But however, we do come from World War I as a world power. We are seen as the Great White Knight. We come into World War I and change the tides and help win the war. So we are seen as this very big power that is emerging from World War I. And when we do not sign the Treaty of Versailles, we do not join the League of Nations. I personally believe that it really sets Europe up for failure because they don't have the support of one of the largest countries and one of the most powerful countries at the time. So this is going to start leading into World War II and what eventually happens with the beginnings of World War II. So I think that's all I have for today. Yeah, so hope you have a good morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you happen to be listening to this, and I will see you soon or talk to you soon, whichever may occur. Bye.